Queen's University in the north. And over my sort of 40 odd years research career, I started off really looking at agri. At that time, we're talking about the early 80s, late 70s. Agri environment schemes were coming in, and I was responsible for looking at those and how we could make farming less intensive. And there's a lot of concern of the damage that farming was doing to the environment. And one of those ways was that we would try and make grassland more sustainable by getting trees onto grassland farms. So by the mid 1980s, late 1980s, I was part of a group that across the UK that was looking at integrating trees into farming systems, and we in Northern Ireland followed. Were part of that program. We set up a major trial on on our research farm at Loughgall in County Armagh and on a hill farm in County Antrim, and that was really looking at how would trees perform in grassland systems, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. Really just to see if the thing would work or all, and it did, and that was the way. Fortunately, the Loughgall site has survived various waves of government cuts and is still there, and is the longest running agroforestry trial in Europe, I believe now. But in part, we planted ash. I mean, ash was one of the trees that did well in it, and of course, you know, we weren't to foresee then what would happen to ash, but I think we've learned a lot of the principles of agroforestry for the trial, and our ash are still there, though some of them are starting to go. But yeah, that's what my background was in that. And since retiring from the active research career there, I've been involved in setting up the Irish Agroforestry Forum to deal with the amount of interest just that was being shown in agroforestry across the island. And that's where I spend a good one of my time now.
Great. And if a farmer was looking to start, so say someone has a greenfield site, where do they start thinking about agroforestry? What are the main kind of tips that you would say to start with?
Yeah. Well, if I could maybe just talk about my own farm, what my decision was to put on agroforestry. First of all, by agroforestry, really, I've always said to people, I don't like the use of the term forestry because it's not really forestry, because people have fixed ideas of what forestry are. Forestry is rows of trees to people, you know, dense trees and a pure crop of trees. Whereas agroforestry is really just trees on farms. It's integrating trees in whatever way possible into the farm structure, whether it's to widen your hedge, provide a shelter belt, provide a riparian buffer, or individually through grassland or clumps in grassland. All those ways that you can look at your whole farm and then see where could I put trees in that would have the minimum impact on my farming business, about running my farm, but would have the maximum impact in terms of the benefit that trees bring. So when I looked at which that's only a small, I only have 30 acres or so left in my farm. And one of the, looking back, this wasn't my original reasoning. I planted agroforestry a bit there in 1995, just to try some of the things I was actually researching on in the trials. But, and so they did reasonably well. I didn't put the time into them I should have over my life, but they're there. And now, when I planted a bit of woodland, in Northern Ireland, we're halfway through an exercise where every field and on every farm in the country is being soil sampled. Now, it's a major soil nutrient health scheme. It's a huge, ambitious program, and it's very good because it means that by the end of 4 years, and we're coming into the third year now of working their way around the country, because it's a big exercise, that every farm and they're doing a LiDAR scan of all farmland so that they can calculate the above ground carbon on those farms from the trees and hedges and things. So at the end of that, every farm will have a carbon count in the north. And the thinking is that that will then be a baseline going forward in terms of agricultural support, because we're out of the EU, we're having to look at different ways of trying to support farmers. And this carbon count it's a very good, it's innovative, it's good. So if I looked at my farm and thought, how am I going to increase the carbon count on it, as well as the other obviouses that trees bring in terms of biodiversity and water quality and livestock health and so on. First thing I did was I looked at my soil map, and I saw, right, there's different types of soil in the farm, and there's a soil map for the whole country, and you can home in on your own bit, because each soil type has a different base carbon count for it, and that's pretty well documented. So I looked at that. Then I looked at the other key features in the farm, and I have 2 streams or water courses that run through the farm. So I looked at, right, I'll put a row of trees along the banks of each of those. And the department, luckily, the last couple of years had a scheme, a riparian planting scheme, which I took advantage of. Then I looked at other ways in which I could, for example, I widened a couple of my hedges with rows of trees, and that has brought more, I'm just about to do that, and that has given the value of trees, but is widening the effect of those trees out into the pasture. Then I have a couple of clumps of trees, 16 sort of 4x4, 5x5 groups of trees fenced off with the individual trees in them not protected other than against hares. So those will then grow up as small copses, if you like, and whenever the fences can then be removed when the trees are big enough and can integrate into, and the animals can graze around the trees. I put willow on the outside so they'll get the benefit of the willow. And then I have individual trees planted, oak, sycamore, ash and stuff. So I've looked at the farm and thought all of those will going ahead will increase my carbon score on my farm. So from a point of view of me being eligible for whatever support there is at the end of the day, that to me is a plus. And by looking at the integrating the trees, it's a sort of an easy winner to try and go ahead. For farmers who don't decide to do that, they'll have a real problem of how do they actually, first of all, hold the soil carbon they have, and secondly, increase that to get any of the benefits that are going, as well as delivering all those wildlife and biodiversity benefits. So if I'm using, if you like, the evidence there is from planting trees into pasture land in my case, so I have one arable field as well, just the benefits those trees bring to the soil. First of all, I'm concerned about soil health and soil carbon, and to the livestock as well. I want the sheep to get the advantage of the tree fodder. There's a lot of current research this last few years done on the effect of tree fodder on livestock, on reducing methane emissions, on animal health in particular, and of course the shade and shelter that the trees are bringing to the animals in terms of a welfare-friendly livestock system. So I have all those benefits, and then from a quantitative basis, it's just to see how they'll increase the carbon content in my farm. So I'm farming with nature, and I'm farming for carbon, if you like, and trees are the key to moving ahead in those directions.
And what was your decision behind what species to use? Or
yeah, the secret is really you got to match your species to your site. Now, my farm is very exposed. It's a coastal farm right on the Ards Peninsula, and it's very exposed. So I had outer trees. I used some Scots pine and sycamore, who are salt tolerant and are, they're typical of the region. Then I also had behind that some wild cherry. I had ash I'd planted originally then. Most of those are gone now. And I've been replanting with some oak and wild cherry. The wetter parts of the field, I've put alder and willow in. Those are trees that like those type of conditions. So I think just the secret is look at your soil and look at your site, the exposure, and then also look at what you want. Think what you want your agroforestry for, or your tree and pasture for. And if tree fodder is a consideration, then trees like willow and so on and alder are good source of fodder for livestock for the benefits I gave. But you might also want to make more use of the trees from a timber point of view. Wild cherry is a very good option. If some of those planted together, they have really good potential to replace ash anyway as the main planting species. Fruit and nut trees, a lot of our orchards we have could be grazed. Some of them are, some of them aren't. There's potential to grow nut trees and to grow a wider range of species. Thinking of climate change too, what's coming down the line, we need to think just of what the type of conditions in 40, 30, 40, 50 years are those trees going to be growing in. Species like sweet chestnut, walnut, those have all got great potential for the future, and we should look to integrate those. but the site has to be suitable, and the look at the exposure and what your objectives are.
And then just finally, before I move on to Clive, but I think when a farmer is thinking about mixing livestock with trees, you know, there's probably a certain fear of like, will they destroy the trees? Or how do I fence them off? How long is it before I can just let the whole thing integrate with each other?
Are you thinking of Clive or myself?
No, sorry, that was you, Jim. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's when we did the initial trials, we just used sheep because we didn't really want to, you know, if you're going to protect trees individually against cattle, then it's a different ball game. You know, it's expensive, but there are ways you can do it. There are, you know, spike guards. You can fence around them. You can use rows of electric fencing, electric wire to keep animals back from trees. But in the initial years, tree protection is the big thing. That's why thinking of things like planting clumps of trees, where you maybe have, you know, 16, 25 trees, you plant those in a clump with a fence around them, which cuts down your cost per tree of fencing. And then the animals can get access to the outside of that. And then when you open it up, when the trees are big enough, they can go in. In the first few years with sheep, the issue is the nibbling of the bark. That was an issue, although we gradually overcame that by using rotational grazing rather than continuous grazing. In the trials we had, the experimental protocol was that we would continuously graze the same sheep on the plots throughout the year so that we could get accurate information on livestock production, on wool growth, on meat quality, on lamb growth, all those sorts of things. You had to keep the same animals on right through. Then, but once that was sort of got through that phase where we were bound by experimental protocol, we started to do some trialing with rotational grazing, where you would just put the animals in, let the grass grow up and accumulate, put the animals in for a fairly short time, a large, whatever number, graze the grass down and then get them out. And then they did very minimal damage to the trees. Cattle don't nibble the bark as much, but the trees need to be just strong enough to take a bit of rubbing. And if you know, once you get over the period that they're strong enough, then there's no reason why you can't have cattle systems. But using electric fencing, innovatively, you can protect rows of trees without having to invest too heavily in individual protection. But it is a big issue at the start. Think closely about how you're going to protect your trees.
Brilliant. Clive, I'll just come to you there if that's okay, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yep.
So Clive, can you please just briefly describe your farming system and then how you've started using agroforestry within that?
Yeah, so I'm still, although I've been talking about it for years, I'm still quite early in my agroforestry journey, but I'm completely sold on it. We've loads of experiments on the farm and stuff. So essentially we have a beef farm, and it was a suckler to beef farm. It's currently just a beef farm. While we get the agroforestry established, just to simplify things. But yeah, I'm based in South Sligo, in kind of rolling drumlin country, and it's very heavy soil on most of our farm. It runs down to kind of wetland bottoms and things. And I found that the key limiting factor across most of the farm was the lack of trees for various different reasons in different contexts. Like on the hill, the kind of upper land of the drumlin, it's very exposed, and it actually dries out quite quickly and can suffer drought if there's a few weeks of no rain or whatever. And wind chill is a big factor in winter there as well. It'll also inhibit grass growth. And then in the bottom ground, it runs down into kind of rushy ground, and soil structures collapse down there. There's a lot of iron pan. And just through kind of accidental experiments initially, and then some more focused ones, we found the trees were solving a lot of the problems in the lower ground. And it's kind of obvious that the upper ground needs more shelter. So been working quite hard on figuring out how to design and alleviate an agroforestry system, and been working a little bit with Jim and the Irish Agroforestry Forum as well, and we've explored loads of options and actually worked quite closely with the department to develop and kind of influence, I suppose, the new agroforestry scheme. And because there's quite a bit of costs incurred in planting and, well, most of the cost is in protecting trees, the scheme now is quite good, actually. And so I'm going to avail of that. I have an application in currently for 23 hectares of agroforestry and loads of different kind of different planting plans and different trees and different layouts and all sorts of stuff based on the different areas throughout the farm that I need to address kind of limiting factors. And yeah, so that's I'm finding that's all been really exciting. My whole life is consumed by that at the moment.
Great, a nice addiction. And just really quickly there, because you mentioned schemes and grants, and I know I'm not asking you to be the world expert on it, but just so people understand, where do you go to the department, but do you need to get, is it your farm is there a forestry advisor or an agroforestry advisor? How does it work for you?
Yeah. So it's all new ground for farmers, the department and the forestry department. So when you apply for an agroforestry grant, it's actually a forestry measure. The department call it FT8 or Forest Type 8. So the application has to be made by a forester. So the first thing I would suggest is connecting with the Irish Agroforestry Forum, because they're kind of the key resource for information and advice. After that, then you need to kind of source a forester that's sympathetic to agroforestry, because some foresters are trained as foresters to plant forestry, and agroforestry is kind of this new thing, and a lot of foresters don't know anything about farming, don't know anything about animals, and have no interest in this kind of new realm. But I think it is gathering momentum, and there are lots of foresters interested. So you do need a forester to make your application and help you through the whole process, which is a little bit arduous, actually. But in hindsight, it's warranted as well, because it's a big project. There's lots of money involved, and doing it properly and making it work is important. So yeah, so the forester is your next step, and if you find a good one that can give you good advice in your agroforestry context, that's where it starts, I suppose. But the Irish Agroforestry Forum are doing loads of farm walks, and I think anyone who's doing it in this kind of initial phase is going to be breaking ground, being quite pioneering. So there's a lot of stuff that's unresolved yet. Just subtle things, really, but it's going to take a little bit of courage just to drive on until there's loads of working examples that people can go and see, more mature stands. Like Jim's research site in Loughgall is kind of the current church in agroforestry, really. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and like until people see that in the flesh, it's actually very hard to envision what agroforestry will look like in 30 years' time. But yeah, it's exciting.
So Jim, just for people who don't know, can you put in the chat box the links to the Agroforestry Forum? That would be great. Clive, just, I mean, you sell your beef direct to the customer through Rare Ruminare, which is a delightful product. How do you feel the agroforestry adds to your product, to your business, to your customers, and to their knowledge, to their education? How do you feel that kind of adds to the whole system of what you do and how you sell direct to a customer?
Well, I suppose firstly, it's more about the actual production and farming thing for me currently. I know it's going to look really cool as a marketing thing. I haven't really leaned on that too heavily yet, but as I kind of mentioned, the limiting factors of the farm are kind of wet and rushy ground in a lot of areas. And like we have lovely little examples on the farm where we planted up trees and we run the cattle through there, and the rushes have just gone, and there's this beautiful lush grass underneath where the underneath the trees where the rushes used to be. And the behavior of the animals changed completely in there. Like they completely calm down. Their flight zone is really short. Like you can get really close to the animals where you mightn't in the open pasture. Their kind of interactions with themselves, like there's a lot of kind of nuzzling, and they get really. There's a load of social behavior between the animals in there, which shows they're really relaxed as well. And all those things, although they sound a bit not airy-fairy, but you know, they're kind of like secondary things. That kind of lack of stress and everything else, it really does add to the kind of productivity of the animals as well, because when they're relaxed, all their metabolism is going on, kind of growing, and you know, they're not stressed. One of the big factors is thermal regulation as well. When animals have access to areas of trees that, you know, if it's really bright sun in the middle of the day, and they can go into these areas of trees to get shade, and they can still eat in there because it's still grass, then the time wasted kind of seeking shade under like a single tree or a bit of a row, a small bit of hedge or something, is now productive growing time as well. So by having this kind of more dynamic landscape with lots of choice, the animals can continue to be calm, relaxed, keep eating, keep growing, and keep so they're not wasting time trying to cool down or keep warm, and wasting energy and food doing that. So all that energy is going into growth and production. So from that point of view, it kind of makes everything work a lot easier. You're creating a better habitat for the livestock so that their life is easier and they produce better. From a marketing point of view, then, like it's a no-brainer. You know, it's a really easy sell. You know, just to be, it's really pretty. It looks beautiful, cows in among trees, and that contentness and level of welfare that is difficult to get anywhere else is, you know, it's all going to be a plus. You know,
the equivalent is skipping unicorns across the sky. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. That's what we're going for.
Paul, I might come to you, and then Ailbhe, I'll come to you. Paul, you used to run a nursery, and then you were telling me there a minute ago that you kind of see that there's a demand for it more. We might talk about species of trees. Your first of all, you might just tell me about your farming system down in West Cork, and then we can maybe talk about some of the species of trees that you have used and that have been successful for you.
Sorry, excuse me. Well, we've got 30 acres down in West Cork here. We've been here 30 years now. And when we first came in, we were quite lucky. The farm was fairly overgrown to start off with. So there's a lot of mature trees. We've sort of enabled those trees to self-seed a lot of the time. I would say 90% of the native trees on the farm have grown by themselves. We were lucky like that, the oaks and the birches and the alders, just by closing places off. The other trees that we introduced, excuse the phone, I'm sorry. We had an interest in nut trees from the start. So we introduced sweet chestnut, walnut, a species of nut called the heart nut, which is a Japanese species, and cob nuts, which are hazelnuts. We tried all these different species just on a trial basis to see what worked. And they all seem to have worked, which was quite an eye-opener for me. The one that was the most successful from a timber point of view was the Japanese walnut, the heart nut. The most amazing growth rate for a tree. And this was all a bit of a gamble for us. We didn't know what we were doing. There was no grants. It was all off our own back. Trying to get hold of the species and the trees themselves was very difficult. we had to import nuts, Japanese walnuts from Canada, grow them on, and then I managed to get some scion wood from another guy in Canada and graft these special varieties. I put them out in a special paddock, which is now 20 years old, and they're flying. They're really flying. So yeah, the different species that we've grown have all succeeded to one great degree or another. The main issue we have at the moment is finding time to harvest everything, which is a bonus, you know. Mm. Going back to, I noticed people were talking about orchards, and we have developed a technique for growing apple trees that you can graze cattle under. We grow the trees on their own roots as opposed to most apple trees are grafted, but we grow the trees on their own roots. So they grow usually more vigorously with a single trunk, and you can grow an apple tree 25 feet tall, graze cattle underneath it. When the harvesting time comes, just clear the ground and harvest the apple straight under the tree. So that's one of the other techniques that we've been trying. We're trying lots of different things and trying to find out what works.
And what have been the challenges? What hasn't worked in particular?
That's a good question. Like Jim said before, the main issue with us was animals damaging trees, and that was because we were set stocking. Once we started to move animals every couple of days, they never got hungry enough or bored enough to start damaging the trees too much. So when I put a fence up in a field now, if I have young trees, I literally put the electric fence around the young trees. They're in there for 1, maybe 2 days. I've changed my grazing system as well, so that there's a longer grazing period. It's gone from 35 days to 60 days. So they're in for 2 days, they're out. I'll move the fence again. The cattle are not hungry enough to do the damage. Occasionally in the winter, when they're really hungry, they'll take the bark off some trees. Mm-hmm. What we did notice with, especially oak, it seemed to like oak bark. Maybe it was the tannins in it for the winter. But what happened was they killed a couple of 10, 15-year-old oak trees. So I basically piled a bunch of brash around the dead oak tree, and it resprouted. So I have a multi-stemmed oak tree growing, or a couple of them. When they grow with multi-stems, the cattle cannot get at the bark all the way around the tree. They can only get at the bark on the outer stem of each of the. So it's like a coppice stool, and they cannot kill the tree after that. So that was one of the challenges that the tree isn't this. It's not a typical tree. It doesn't look as pretty, but it's actually probably better for wildlife. There's a lot of dead wood in it, and a lot of branches and a lot of overgrowth. The other challenge is we found sweet chestnut does not like the damp. It needs dry feed. It really does. And this last winter, we lost a couple of the Japanese heart nuts due to dampness as well, because it never dried up all winter. The ground was waterlogged for the whole winter, and I think they just drowned. Mm-hmm. I think we need to perhaps just keep on trying. I need to keep on trying these things, and over time we will breed out the faults in some of these trees by selecting the best ones that can survive the conditions. The next generation will work from that. It's a bit of a breeding program, really.
Mm. And on your particular land, by having so many trees, does it allow you to have your cattle outdoors for longer? Are you 12 months outdoors, or?
Yeah, we're out wintering. Yeah.
You're out wintering. You're Dexter's. Yeah. Okay. And do you feel that the trees are a massive benefit to allowing that?
Most definitely. When you get a bad winter, a bad period in the winter, I've got a few places where I will winter them for like a week or two in the winter. There's a 6-acre place where I take them in for a week or two. I'll just basically unroll bales of hay underneath the trees there. I buy my hay in because I haven't really got enough acreage to make hay as well. I unroll the hay under there, and it can transform briery, mossy patches under the trees to a grass sward within 2 or 3 years. The only other issue is if you want a grass sward under some quite dense trees, you have to either thin them, or what we've been doing a bit of experiment is what's called pollarding, where we literally cut the tree at 6 or 8 feet high. It forms a new headed branches out of the reach of the browsing animals, but it also lets the light down into the ground so the grass sward can grow again. You can do it in the summer to feed the animals the foliage if you want. We can do it in the winter and harvest the firewood. So we're getting 2 or 3 harvests. We can get nuts, we can get firewood, we can get the grass and the beef off the land as well. So it's a multi-cropping system.
So the tree maintains its health even through pollarding, like?
I've been told, and I believe it's true, that most pollarded trees live longer than unpollarded trees. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. They're all designed to be grazed by animals at one point or another in their life. They're not going to get away with not being eaten at some point. And so, yeah, they do live longer. They might. It's not great from a timber point of view because they will rot in the middle. But from a wildlife point of view, that rotten wood is more valuable than the non-rotten wood in terms of for fungi, for insects, all the invertebrates. I think half of the species that are listed for oak live on the dead wood or the rotting wood. So we do need more dead wood in the landscape, definitely. Yeah.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
So just because you've come from a nursery background, I mean, there's a lot of press obviously about people importing, hawthorns for their hedgerows and different. Can you just take us through the provenance of trees? If people want to start out doing agroforestry, where should they try and find their trees, or what species do you think that they should start with, and where should they source these?
Depending on your land, I mean, people have already mentioned alder and birch. I think it's very hard to get native provenance trees. I think there's a few initiatives, there's Trees on the Land, there's a few other initiatives which are, but for the agroforestry system, I wouldn't know. I think they have to be certified from a certified nursery. A lot of the stuff is imported from Holland, which is the epicenter for plant diseases in Europe. So we really need to get away from that and be growing our own. I mean, I grew most of my 98% of my trees myself. I don't think you can grow your own trees for the agroforestry scheme, unfortunately. It would be nice to get farmers in an area to be able to grow their own trees. It's not that difficult. If you can grow vegetables, you can grow trees. And then you just transplant them out to where you want and go from there. Sourcing trees is a minefield, really. Like I say, because I don't buy them, I wouldn't know where to get them from.
Okay, fair enough. Ailbhe, I'll just come on to you there. If you want to unmute yourself, if that's okay. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, perfect. Ailbhe, you have a gorgeous woodland there down, but it's relatively young. Can you just take me through your farming system, your woodland, and how you manage your woodland?
Yeah, great to be here and great to hear all the words of wisdom from Jim and Paul and Clive. I've got kind of 3 areas of trees on the farm and 2 orchards. But I think that the area you're talking about is a 15-acre, 30-year-old broadleaf plantation. So it was planted around a couple of old ash trees and beech trees in what had been parkland. So it's relatively new as a woodland environment, but there are interesting species coming in like bluebells, and I tried putting in some wild garlic, but it wasn't damp enough. Didn't like it. It is an area that I'm working on actually with the Irish Agroforestry Forum. We did an assessment of the species on the forest floor. We're looking at putting livestock in as an experiment to see, can you manage continuous cover forestry along with livestock in the wood. So it's a slightly tricky one, and it's going to need careful fencing and assessment. And actually, we're looking for an ecologist to do some assessments. So if anybody is an ecologist or knows one who'd be interested in working with us in Tipperary, that would be really interesting. The little native woodland, which is a bit higher on the farm, it's about 5 acres, and it's sort of a sad story. It had been mostly ash, and it had been self-seeded from being cleared. It was originally a native woodland back hundreds of years, according to the maps, was cleared in about 1870, 1880, and had self-established as a mostly ash and a bit of hazel and holly on a rocky hilltop. Unfortunately, a lot of that has got ash dieback now. But I noticed when I put sheep in, because I have a small flock of sheep, that they go straight for the fallen ash leaves and hoover them up. They really like them. So I think there's something in there from what Jim says, that livestock have like deterrent effect on the ash dieback, because they do like to clean up the leaves, which carry a lot of the spores. So that's useful. So we're planting in oak trees into that native woodland, native oaks, which you can get, by the way, from None So Hardy in Wicklow, in Chillela. So they're one of the few native species growers that I know of in Ireland. But it's a tricky one. If you want to put in agroforestry, I'm really interested in agroforestry as on trees on farms, basically as filling in corners, thickening up hedgerows, generally giving shelter. My animals, I've really noticed that do you remember 6 years ago, the beasts from the east and any animals out were really suffering? Well, my sheep were out in woodland, and every time I went to check on them, every day they came bouncing out of the woodland in great form. I mean, no bother at all, not in the slightest bit deterred by, foot deep snow and minus 18 degrees temperatures. So it's a real indication to me that livestock really like having trees to shelter under, to browse on, but they can do damage. I had a neighbour of mine had a dairy beef herd that broke in from next door, and they went straight for, I have a little pilot truffle orchard which has some Scots pines and hazels, and they absolutely decimated the Scots pines. They killed quite a few of them in one night. They stripped the bark. There's obviously something in the Scots pine bark that they really liked. They went at it, their little bovine teeth, and just like ripped the bark off, and basically treed them. They just killed some of them. So you do have to be careful about protection from animals and be aware of the different heights of animals. Like sheep absolutely love getting at seedlings and saplings, and they'll stand up and they'll knock them down so they can, bend them over so they can chew away. They really like that. And cattle will do sort of rubbing and scratching and biting higher up. Once they get to be a certain size, then it's not so much of a problem, obviously.
And do you protect your woodlands? Well, obviously not from your neighbours, but apart from that. But how do you protect your trees when you need to, when they're growing?
Under the native Irish woodland scheme, when we planted in the native oaks, they all had to be protected with stakes and plastic tubing, which is kind of hideous looking, but it is useful because when it gets briars start growing, you can still see them popping out. But in nature, oak trees don't mind briars at all. Isn't that right, Jim? They just keep on growing. It acts as a natural livestock deterrent. So oak trees will pop. Yeah, they'll pop out of briars and then eventually shade them out. But we're in a bit too much of a hurry. We prefer to have things a bit more controlled under the forestry schemes. I think there's huge potential, as Clive was saying. I've got some of the area of my farm is a couple of fields are slightly peaty, and they're starting to go a little bit acidic and growing silverweed and rushes. So I'm looking at that for doing agroforestry to try and improve that acidification, and obviously put some lime on. But I think things like birch and hazel could work really well in that kind of damp, peaty soil. So I'm talking to a forester about putting in an application for that. Also, there's a great scheme at the moment called Native Woodlands, I think it is. Can't remember the name. You can plant a hectare or possibly 2, depending on circumstances, of native woodlands, which seems to be a really good option, and it doesn't have to be in a big block. I mean, what I'm looking at, my forester is basically thickening up a hedgerow around 2 sides of a field. So it can be in that kind of a format that would work really well with whatever type of shape and size of field you have. So there's loads of potential with trees. So we're looking at livestock in established woodland, looking at agroforestry systems to use fields that aren't great in a better way, using them for fruit. I'm looking at a scheme, there's the food forest scheme, which is really interesting. And at the moment, they are requiring 60% of the trees to be timber trees, and then the other 40% fruit, which doesn't seem to fall in under my understanding of a food forest. So maybe somebody can comment on that one. I think they might need to change that definition to help people sort of get involved in food forests, which is the idea of layering timber trees, fruit trees, nut trees, shrub layers, and then vegetables underneath. I mean, it's relatively tricky in the Irish climate because the weeds grow all the time. Vegetables need sunlight. There's like all the vegetables I know, vegetable growers I know wouldn't consider growing under trees because you need like consistent sunlight to help things grow. But there's loads of potential there to do shrubs and fruit trees and nut trees in the same area with a bit of careful management. The other thing I'd say, I don't think anybody managed to mention silva arable. So I grow organic crops like organic barley as well. And we just made some beer this year from our barley, which was very exciting. And I'd be quite interested in looking at silva arable potential, which is widely spaced rows of trees and where you can run machinery, combine harvesters up and down the rows. But it's something, you know, cautiously look at and have a look at making it work and making sure that the light is falling enough on the crops and that they don't get too damp, because it's a real problem with combine harvesting. You need relatively uniform ripeness of the seeds, of the seed heads. So under trees and on the headlands, they tend to be a little damper, a little greener. But taking that into account, I think there still is potential for silva arable as well as silva pasture.
Yeah, well, I'll ask Jim about that in a minute, but just to help clarify the difference for people in the audience. But Ailbhe, just one last question there. You seem to have tapped into a lot of schemes and stuff, which is great. The investment needed might scare people off, or do you feel that the schemes support sufficiently for the farmer?
Well, the schemes that I've been working with are the established woodland, like the forestry schemes for established woodlands. And I'm just poking into the agroforestry now. So I don't know how it's going to fall out. I don't know how easy it is going to be to get the grant. I mean, they're quite severe on, I suppose not quite the right word, they're quite firm on the terms for forestry schemes. For instance, with the native woodland, I planted in the oaks, and then 3 years later they came back and checked them, and I had to clear some briars before they pay the remainder of the grant. So there's things like that it wasn't affecting the tree growth, but they didn't like the look of it, you know, that kind of thing. So I think it would be great if agroforestry was under its own system, which would be more to do with agriculture than under the forest scheme. But we are where we are. And the last thing is that I'm a beekeeper as well. So I've got the native Irish bee, several hives on the farm, and they absolutely love woodlands. It's because bees are native to woodlands. That's where they would naturally have evolved to live in. They hollowed out trunks of standing dead timber and half-rotten trees, and so they really rely, we don't realize very much, they love sycamore, they love the willow in the spring, they really rely on tree blossom, because we don't recognize quite often the blossoms that are on trees, but they have a huge amount of nectar. And there's obviously, trees have huge surface areas, so a huge amount of bees can forage. So if you're interested in bees, definitely plant trees, because they are really beneficial.
Brilliant. And in general, I suppose, it's great for biodiversity and wildlife on your farm. Jim, just coming back to you, Ailbhe obviously mentioned there's silva arable, and then the silva pastoralism. And so for a farmer who has a tillage farm, is there set rules on the kind of spacing, and is there guidelines on the forum how to do this, where to start, that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, silva arable hasn't been researched as much, certainly in Ireland, because pastures, the main agriculture industry have, but there is an opportunity for it. And there's a lot of research done in England, in particular, in the bigger cereal areas there, and in Europe. So there's a lot of information available. Yeah, and there is some detail in the agroforestry booklet, once you can see that, which the Irish Agroforestry Forum has produced and Clive has designed and made, which helps explain a bit more depth about the agroforestry measure, and that's available online. We can supply that, but there is some guidance given on silvoarable. The main grant is targeted towards silvopasture, but there is an option for silvoarable planting. Obviously, you have less expense to put into tree protection, so it's a bit lower, but still, in my opinion, fairly generous. From those of us in Northern Ireland who have no grants at all, we're envious of the support there is in the south. The principle in the silvoarable, obviously, is how do you accommodate machinery and large machinery in that. So there, they still have gone for this, the recommended spacing of 400 trees per hectare, but rather than putting those as spacings, you can put those in fairly tight rows, you know, up to 20 meters apart. So that will allow for all the conventional arable design. In Loughgall, we put in a hectare of silvoarable with poplar and barley in the mid-1990s. The poplar were 14 meters apart. That gave us a 12-meter row, which was sort of half a sprayed room width. And we were able to grow barley under those trees for the first 6 years. Without really any significant impact on the crop, and the field was ploughed each year, so the tree roots were actually being pruned by the ploughing, and that stimulates tree growth and reduces soil competition with the crop. After about 6 years, that's really long enough to grow a barley crop in the one ground. We looked at other options from that. For example, we talked to a nearby horticulture producer, and we did a few wee trials with leeks on that, and they grew well in Agroforestry. And I put that in the chat just to say that we didn't do any measurements on them because we wanted to see if he would rent the field, but he didn't. So we actually went, we actually put that down into grass. So that area is now silvopasture, and we've had no expensive tree protection because by then the trees were big enough and well past the establishment stage. But no, Ailbhe's right. I mean, silvopasture arable gives you a lot of options. I think it comes back to my point right at the start that agroforestry is a term which covers a whole range of things, right? From, I mean, we have a couple of growers in the north who have rows of fruit bushes, for example, in a type of silvoarable. They're growing a mixture of berries protected with the electric wire, and then they're grazing sheep between those. You know, that's a type of silvoarable type scenario, if you like. We have people who have put in coppice willow, and then put rows of cherry higher growing trees in the coppice willow, which they don't coppice, they just allow to grow. So you're getting a multi-story system. There's a whole range of options out there, and I know the terms and conditions for the grant are very specific, but you know, and DAFM genuinely are trying to look at ways they can target that grant to different you know, to different scenarios, and trying not to be too prescriptive and allow people to be innovative. And I think that is really the secret on how you do that. So I mean, I've seen from the trials in England, which same latitude as here, the walnut grown well, in black walnut grown well in wheat crops, really good, a valuable tree species producing a very valuable fruit, and you know, no problem with harvesting the arable crop, getting the benefits of the shelter, and in that strip below the trees, they tend to get a lot of ladybirds there, which are controlling the aphids. And Leeds University have done some trials which show that you can actually reduce the plant protect, you know, the spray input to the crop to protect it, if you have strips of just left to grow wild at the bottom of the rows of trees, and that'll help reduce the aphid population. So yes, there's a lot of scope for a silvoarable type situation, particularly maybe integrating your fruit and nuts, which you can put in a percentage of, say, I think it's 30%, but Clive would keep me right, of fruit and nut trees into the agroforestry mix. So in a silvo-arable situation, mixing those perhaps with other trees could give you a really good variety of crop. And using tree mixtures, I mean, I think overall in that type of scenario, the more mixtures of trees you can use, the better. We've seen the problems with single species of trees. You get a disease in, you're in a really disastrous situation. And we know that ecological systems are much more diverse and much better for biodiversity, for soil, if you have mixtures of species, and they're more resilient to weather and climate. So that applies to trees as well. And if you use tree mixtures, the root systems of trees are different. They're exploiting different parts of the soil. Obviously, their fodder is different. And it's got different nutritional and microelement properties. So incorporating mixtures into both silvo-arable and silvopastoral systems can bring a lot of benefits.
Thanks, Jim, for that. So I'm just going to ask each of the farmers just one last brief question, because we're coming towards the end of the hour. But Clive, starting with you, how comfortable do you feel with all the changing climate that you are future-proofing your farm? Do you want to get yourself off mute there? Oh, I think you disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, cool. Very good. Yeah, very comfortable actually. Like Paul, we're also out wintering, and as I was alluding to at the start, I think the lack of trees is our main limiting factor, and the more we kind of reduce those limiting factors, the more resilient the farm is. So it's obvious in many ways, and anecdotally, it's kind of easy to see. But in Loughgall, Jim did some great work there, measuring the soil saturation under trees and how much longer this soil could hold animals up without doing any damage in the wintertime under trees. And if you stack that together with grazing management, then it just buffers everything and allows you to do a lot more and keep animals safely outside without doing any damage to the trees or the soil. And just to reiterate what everyone else has said about rotational grazing, I think that's the key to all agroforestry. Without rotational grazing, any kind of set grazing, you're heading for disaster. Little bits of experience around cattle eating trees, especially when they're young. We pile the animals into young trees as well, relatively young, 6 to 8 years old kind of thing. We start putting them in at that stage to maintain the understory, because with cattle, we're excluding the cattle from the planted areas for a short time, and then but it's very important to maintain the kind of pasture underneath those, and you can do that just with management of your animals, just by their impact on the soil and the plants, and their grazing effect will knock back all the kind of brushy understory that happens underneath those trees, and they just the act of their presence and slight disturbance with their hooves and their grazing action will actually stimulate pasture. There was a good few questions there at the start about what to plant underneath. You can actually just stimulate pasture by bursts of intense kind of animal impact, and then taking them off that and allowing that to fully recover. You're, like as Paul said, you're talking 30 to 60 days for that to happen. So what you're really watching for there in a young system, I suppose, is that the new seedlings that grow after that kind of impact get to a stage where they're robust enough to be grazed again.
Brilliant. And Clive's got some gorgeous drawings here in the chat box if anyone wants to have a look. And they're in the Agroforestry booklet, which is on the Irish Agroforestry Forum. Clive is also the illustrator of our new handbook that's coming out in a few weeks' time, and he's got some fantastic illustrations in that as well. So feel free to buy it if you haven't bought it yet. You can buy it on farmingfornature.ie. Paul, just one last comment from you. I mean, we've talked about kind of the trees, the livestock, the productivity. Your farm, do you feel a nicer place to live? Like, you know, the wealth of the actual farm, not just your bank account, but where you are. Do you think it's very important that you're in an agroforestry system for you?
Oh, completely. Yeah, I can look out the window now, and I'm just watching rooks planting acorns in the field in front of us. The wildlife. I love the wildlife anyway, but it's just gone crazy. Well, it was pretty good, but then it's had a dip. But since we changed the management, we've seen species we've not seen before in the last couple of years. We've seen goshawks, which is a very rare bird of prey. That visited us the last couple of months, keeping the crow numbers down and the rabbit numbers down, and it's all balancing out. It's a wonderful place to live. Yeah, I love it. Absolutely love it. Yeah. Just wouldn't swap it for the world. Yeah.
Thank you. Ailbhe, just one last comment from you. If you were giving farmers that are listening an idea of where you went for advice and support around agroforestry and forestry and combining your farm with the two, where would you suggest people go?
The Irish Agroforestry Forum with Jim is a huge source of knowledge and practical know-how, and also sort of decades of trials. So it's great to have this resource in Ireland, where, you know, in an Irish context, agroforestry has been trialed and shown to have worked. And obviously, and I've just been reading the chat, there's Knots have an agroforestry help group as well, which is great. Great to know. I'm going to investigate that. And then the nurseries are very helpful. There's obviously there's this Shillelagh, Nunsahardy, but there's also fruit and nut, Irish fruit and nut growers who have tree nurseries. So there's one up in there was one in Mayo, and there's a couple of great ones in Cork. So I'm just trying to remember the contact details for them, but they are very helpful for of course, Seed Savers in Clare, just across Lough from us, have lots of Irish old type Irish apple trees, and those kind of old growth, heritage varieties. Yeah, there are there's quite a few out there. It'd be nice to have them all gathered together in one place so you can have a look. And it would be also great if there was a list of foresters, because you have to have a forester to do an agroforestry application. If there was a list of foresters that had agroforestry know-how and interest, that would be really helpful, because you can quite often bounce from forester to forester looking for someone who's comfortable to do an agroforestry application.
Valid point. Okay. Well, listen, we're coming to the end of the hour. I just want to thank our speakers hugely: Jim McAdam, Paul McCormick, Clive Bright, and Ailbhe Gerrard. Jim, I'll come to you for a last word in a second, but just to say thanks a million for anyone who missed part of this or would like to share it with anyone. It will be up on our YouTube channel in a few hours. We also have another couple of webinars on tomorrow night and the following night, so do register and join. And we look forward to seeing you then. Jim, you wanted to have one last word there?
Yeah, just a final word. Thank you, Bridget, very much for chairing so well, and thanks to everyone for supporting the forum and so on. Just a final word. I mean, agriculture and farmers is under a huge amount of public pressure. There's a lot of concern with people about the quality of the food they're eating and how their food is produced. And you know, all the surveys and all, we look at it, introducing trees into farming systems is something that the wider public can engage with. And I think going ahead, animal welfare and how we treat our animals and the conditions we put them is going to be a really big driving factor in food systems and in making farming, as we do it, more acceptable to the public and doing it correctly. And certainly agroforestry, or just introducing trees into animal systems, is a win-win situation in terms of animal welfare, and I think that is really going to improve the image of our agriculture, as well as bring all the environmental and ecosystem benefits that we know that they do. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for that. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and your farms today, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for your time. Goodbye.
All right.